Hello, and welcome to The Stories We Tell Ourselves. This event is part of the inaugural Sussex Festival of Ideas, a dynamic and engaging programme of talks, events and activities. The festival is produced by the newly formed School of Media, Arts and Humanities at Sussex University. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the Sussex Festival of Ideas website after the festival. Live captioning is available and can be activated by pressing the live transcript button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, if you should wish. We welcome questions via the question and answer panel, and we'll respond to these later on in the event. A member of the festival's team might contact webinar attendees for their feedback after the event. If you do not wish to be contacted, please email the festival's producer or a member of the festival team to opt out of these communications. And you can find their contact details on the festival website. Housekeeping done, it is now my great pleasure to hand over to Naj Rashid, who is going to formally introduce and welcome you to this special event.
Thank you, Margareta, and welcome to all of you who've joined us this evening. I'm Dr. Naj Rashid. I'm a lecturer in Media and Cultural Studies in the School of Media, Arts and Humanities. I'm also the director of the Sussex Centre for Cultural Studies. So I'm delighted to be introducing and chairing this event, The Stories We Tell Ourselves, with our Stuart Hall Fellow in Residence, Rebecca Omonira-Oyekanmi, and the chair of the Trustees of the Stuart Hall Foundation, Gilane Tawadros, who will be opening the session with a few words about the Stuart Hall Foundation and talking about the relationship with Sussex University and the Fellows network. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Gilane.
Thank you so much, Naj. It's wonderful to be here at Sussex's Festival Ideas, and I'm very much looking forward to Rebecca's keynote talk. For those of you who don't already know about us, the Stuart Hall Foundation was established 5 years ago, inspired by the life and work of Professor Stuart Hall. The foundation is a small charity with big ambitions, committed to public education, and in particular to addressing urgent questions of race and inequality in culture and society, through talks and events, and also by building a growing network of Stuart Hall Fellow scholars, activists, and artists in residence. The foundation is about diversifying academia and providing creative opportunities, extending radical thought, scholarship, and cultural practice, fostering intergenerational creative exchange, creating a space for the imagination, and advocating for social and racial justice. For those of you who don't know who Stuart Hall was, he was a Jamaican British academic, writer, and cultural studies pioneer who was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1932 and died in London aged 82 in February 2014. Stuart was director of the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies and professor of sociology at the Open University. He presented a number of television programmes, including the BBC series Redemption Songs and many broadcasts for the Open University. He also chaired the arts organisations Innova and Autograph and was the first editor of New Left Review, a founding editor of the journal Soundings, and author of many articles and books on politics and culture, including Policing the Crisis and The Great Moving Right Show, in which he famously coined the term Thatcherism. Stuart was a Rhodes Scholar at Merton College, Oxford, and we've always envisaged our scholarships and fellowships programme as a kind of alternative Rhodes network, speaking truth to power, challenging racial and social injustice, and imagining different and more equal futures so we can bring them into existence. We were really thrilled that Sussex University was one of our first university partners when we began building our Scholars and Fellows programme. And I'm hugely grateful to Marina Pedrera Felarino, Margarita Jolly, and Naj Rashid for building a very special partnership between the Stuart Hall Foundation and the University of Sussex, and for making possible the Stuart Hall Fellowship, as well as the Stuart Hall MA scholarships. We were very proud to welcome Rebecca as the Stuart Hall Fellow at University of Sussex 2019-2020. And she exemplifies the very special kind of people who are Stuart Hall Fellows, scholars and artists in residence. Above all other things, Stuart was a public intellectual who urged us to mobilize everything we have in terms of intellectual resources in order to understand what keeps making the lives we live and the societies we live in profoundly anti-humane. In one of his most well-known essays, The Great Moving Right Show, Stuart argued that we can only be politically effective. In other words, we can bring about social and political change only on the basis of a serious analysis of things as they are, not as we would wish them to be. Rebecca is a brilliant example of someone whose work as an independent journalist over the past decade has focused precisely on examining with forensic analysis the reality of things as they are, the impact of austerity policies on working class communities, on the government's treatment of migrants and refugees, through the prism of women's lives and experiences, which puts both in stark relief. At our annual public conversation in 2019, which had as its theme resistance, Rebecca bore witness to the experience of a Jamaican man called Carlington Spencer, who died tragically in the immigration detention centre, Morton Hall, after medical staff failed to treat his stroke as a medical emergency. I was reminded of Rebecca's powerful and determined act of bearing witness to Carlington Spencer's life and death when I read a piece by the Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mirvis, who grew up in apartheid South Africa. In this article in The Guardian, he exhorted us not to ignore or look away from the genocide of Uyghur Muslim minority in China, reminding us that whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. When I heard Rebecca speak at the Stuart Hall Foundation public conversation, I heard an extraordinary woman whose work is an invocation to all of us to listen and become witnesses too. Over to you, Rebecca.
Oh, thanks so much, Gilane. That was so generous. I really appreciate that. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. I think I've done it, and just sort of anyone sort of say if I haven't or it's not working. Great. So I'm going to talk for 15 minutes reflecting on my work as a journalist and partnership with Stuart Hall Foundation and the School of Media Arts and Humanities. And then after that, we'll have time for hopefully a fruitful discussion based on some of the things I've talked about and some of the things that Naz and Gilane have mentioned. So just to start, I want to describe a little bit about how I work and what I do. So I'm an independent journalist specialising in a particular type of investigative narrative reporting. And my approach to the craft is to bring together the tools of journalistic investigation and inquiry. So that's news getting, pounding the streets reporting, laser accurate detail, and to pair them up with tools more usually associated with literary fiction and feature writing. So narrative, character, scene setting. And some of you might wonder, when your subject is social injustice, why bother? When attempting to highlight sites of social harm and injustice, shouldn't the focus be on the macro, the facts and the stats, the hard news? Isn't the crucial thing the wrong that has been done? It's the question that I grapple with on every story. What often tips the balance is consent and willing from the people at the heart of every piece, the people whose lives are more than just the worst thing that has ever happened to them. What I do know for certain is that I want my readers to finish a piece. Sorry, I'm just going to pause because I think we've had a slight tech issue and apparently you can't see my screen. I'll just share it again. Sorry about this. This is totally my fault. The organisers I've really prepared for all eventualities, but I have failed here. Okay, I think that should be working now. Are we all good tech people? Brilliant, thank you. And sorry to the audience for having to sort of stop suddenly there. So yeah, as I was saying, I was talking about why I bother with a literary approach to news stories about injustice. And one of the things that I think about and I try and work through when I'm working on a story is trying to encourage readers for whom there's no obligation to finish a piece. There's no obligation to read about someone somewhere harmed by a system that we're all complicit in. But I do know for certain is that I want those readers to finish the piece, not to turn away. So in creating narrative, I can do more than just document pain and despair. And it's much easier to collaborate with people who trust me with their stories, as opposed to extracting the worst parts and stripping them of life on the page. And when I think about working this way, I think about Kezia Leatherbarrow, a teenager from Lancashire, who took her life after being detained in a police cell for more than 2 days. Nearly 3 years after her death, I interviewed her mum, Martina, at her home in Manchester and wrote the story as part of a series into cuts to young people's mental health services. The story of a decimated services for young people, the aggression of the police when dealing with vulnerable teenagers, one family's fight for justice and accountability, that story tells itself. It could be told in a hard news piece. But what Martina helped me to write in the end was something richer in detail. Those quiet moments when my tape recorder was off and we looked through old family photos of Kezia, alive and happy. What I have learned in 10 years documenting austerity Britain is the solidarity, community and kinship that is always there in every story where people seem small and helpless in the face of the brute hand of the state or unchecked, rampant corporate power. It is the silent and tireless force of community, action and a determination to get at justice, truth and accountability, always to ensure that no one suffers what they do. And without narrative, it's difficult to create a full record of this. There isn't always room to show a person beyond what has been done to them. There isn't always room to show how each day they fight and fight and fight some more. There isn't always room to inspire hope as well as anger. And it's not my own design. I'm not looking for it really, but very simply in the process of documenting stories of hardship, I find resistance and solidarity ever present. Take, for example, my reporting on Black mental health published back in 2014. The news story was that mental health trusts were being asked by the coalition government to cut 20% more from their budget than other hospitals, which combined with changes to the social welfare system had intensified pressure on vulnerable people. Digging deeper, I found these cuts to mental health spending would collide with existing racial inequalities in the sector. So along with the fact of the cuts, I had a ton of statistics about the higher use of restraint against Black people in mental health settings, especially men of Caribbean heritage, and the fact that when Black people were sectioned, they were more likely to have been sent there by a judge or the police, compared to white people who were more likely to have been sectioned by a GP. And digging even further, spending more time, the story became more of a story about how the cuts had played out in coalition Britain. And so here I want to read a couple of extracts from the work and to introduce you to Devon, who at the time was struggling with the benefit changes. I call myself the wounded healer, says Devon, a tall, thin musician with cropped hair peppered with grey. He is 54 years old. Behind his wire-frame glasses, his expression is solemn as he describes the work of Sound Minds, the mental health charity and social enterprise he helped to set up 20 years ago. Devon was first sectioned by the police in the early 80s. I don't know why the police came. I hadn't done anything wrong. He talks to me as if it happened just yesterday and not 32 years ago. They said, "Come on, we're taking you to hospital." But there was nothing wrong with me. Devon stayed sectioned for 6 months, tranquilised every few days, physically restrained by police officers on the ward, and subjected to electroconvulsive therapy and diagnosed as schizophrenic. There was nothing wrong with me before that, he says again. During this time, Black mental health was subject to public debate. This is Lord Avebury speaking in the House of Commons in 1982, the year Devon was first sectioned. And he said, "It is said by the West Indian community that psychiatrists in the prison and indeed in the hospital service as a whole are not properly trained in recognising the different cultures of ethnic minorities, and that as a result, people may be wrongly diagnosed as suffering from mental illness when they talk, for instance, as the Rastafarians frequently do about God." Not long before this, a young Black Rastafarian called Richard Campbell was convicted of attempted burglary. In prison, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and medicated. He refused to eat. An officer found Richard dead in his cell on the 31st of March, 1980. He was 19 years old. The official cause of death was dehydration, and the inquest jury returned a verdict of self-neglect, expressing, to quote, "concern at the lack of specialist care facilities in prison." The anger around Richard's death, and it took some time to establish what exactly had happened to him in custody, was a trigger for the Brixton riots. So in that piece about Black mental health, I also talked to a woman called Rav, who joined the movement of Black-led organisations tackling state racism in the mental health service throughout the 80s and 90s. Now, Raj came to the movement after 20 years spent in and out of hospital. She told me, "I have had so many different diagnoses. I would go into crisis not really knowing what was wrong, but just feeling like I didn't fit, either in my family or the world around me." Raj's father came to England from India in 1947, and her mother and siblings followed soon after. She was born in London. In between long months in hospital, she tried to carry on her life. She worked in a science lab. And after many years of revolving door admissions and during a period of relative stability, Raj tentatively started to question her own treatment. The idea of challenging the system frightened and worried her. Hadn't these people saved her life? But Raj attended a few Black mental health events in Brixton in South London in the 90s. And she told me that there was a lot of stuff going on in the voluntary sector in those days. There was a lot of activism around race and mental health and the overrepresentation of young Black men in psychiatric hospitals. And one of these was Orville Blackwood, a young Black man who had died in Broadmoor as a result of being restrained. His mum was amazing. She was going around with this picture of her son, and she was so passionate. I'd never been political before, but now I began to see things through a different lens. Now, both Devon and Raj and the other people I interviewed for the piece had stories of resistance and carried buried deep within the wounds of historical racism, so entwined and embedded in their present day experiences that a simple quote from either would only tell part of their story. And working in this way is about more than just form, more than the finished product, the narrative non-fiction piece of investigative journalism. How I report the story is key. In the masculine world of investigative journalism, there are certain stories deemed worthier than others, those with power given more space than people harmed by those in power. Yes, follow the money, but what if we follow the people too, the people most harmed by the state and corporate power? In adopting this approach, you witness, alongside the stories of suffering, stories of organising and challenge. And in that vein, here's an extract from a piece I wrote about single parents in Southampton, who found themselves not only facing drastic cuts to services that they relied on to raise their children and sustain families and communities, but the target of regular attacks in the pages of the Daily Mail. Just read from the piece. Word spread about Angela's effort to organise single parents, and her friend Gabrielle, also a single mother to a 10-year-old, agreed to host initial meetings at her salon on the outskirts of the city centre. The first meeting takes place on a Friday morning. The women drop in and out between school hours. The salon fills quickly. Women sit in 2 large barber chairs and on a stool and lean against the lilac walls. The salon is small, taking up just one room. Bright rows of jars and bottles line one wall, and 2 large mirrors fill one another. Gabrielle is at the centre of things. People wave as they hurry by the shop, and her phone buzzes constantly. A quietly commanding presence, wearing a fitted mauve skirt suit, her long black braids tied from her face, she coaxes the other women in a lilting voice. "How are you, sister?" she asks a young woman who has stopped by to make an appointment. "We are talking about single mothers. You too are now single, right?" The woman who she spoke to had just started attending the job centre after being thrown out by her husband, and nodded and happily joined the discussion. Gabrielle opened the salon 3 years ago. Her counsellor at the time tried to persuade her not to, telling her to apply for sickness benefit and seek specialist counselling for post-traumatic stress. Gabrielle, originally from the Democratic Republic of Congo, refused. At the time, she was unemployed and signing on for job seekers allowance. And before that, when her son was a toddler, she worked 20 hours a week and studied accounting at university. But it was too expensive and difficult to balance. "It was a crazy life," she said. "At a young age, you just feel like a grandmother." While Gabrielle is positive, the others are less so. "We have a government that doesn't understand our situation, doesn't understand our territory, hasn't lived our experience," said Angela, the other mum. "So every time they bring an academic to come up with a new solution, the solutions never seem to work. And it's partly because they don't consult us." "It's because they don't care," says a petite woman with pale brown skin and dark-tired eyes. When Charlie first went to the job centre, on switching from income support to JSA, she was studying 2 days a week for a GCSE in English and an access course to maths and study skills. A job centre advisor told her to quit so that she could spend the whole week searching for work. "I cried. I couldn't do it," she said. Indeed, she refused to quit, completing her courses and eventually found shift work with an agency as a carer for children with disabilities. So now she's a bank member of staff on a 0 hours contract, which means she must be available when the agency calls. If they call, it's a big battle. "You know you are free, but you're not actually free. My son will finish school soon. I need someone to pick him up. I need someone to stay with him. You have to know where to put the child first before you can say yes. But say no too often and you lose the job." Another crucial tool when I'm working on these sorts of stories is learning. Now, reporting the way I do provides the time and space to think about what might be learned from a particular struggle. Sometimes it's clear and obvious. For example, when I reported on Afghan refugees protesting with lips sewn shut in central Athens, they had learned from Iranian refugees in the very same Greek square before them. They worked alongside students and other Greeks who were radicalised by the devastating fallout from the financial crisis in 2008. And in England too, I met people facing housing eviction who had been supported by activists who'd learned tactics during Occupy London and in opposing government cuts. And these movements for sure paved the way for the unique coalitions coming together now for the Kill the Bill protests and the Black Lives Matter protests we've had this past year. But on other stories, we must dig a bit deeper to document the true legacies. When beginning a piece a few years ago on the success of the Greenham Common protests during the 1980s, I began with the fact that nuclear arms still existed, but ended my research and writing with so much more. And here's an extract from that piece. For the women involved, Greenham Common Peace Camp was transformative. It was about more than peace. It would mutate from a single issue protest against the sighting of American cruise missiles in Britain to a general movement of women who felt keenly the lacuna in the public space for women's voices. The camp attracted astonishing numbers from every walk of life. For some, here was a corner of England just for women. The location, outside a military base for storing nuclear bombs, added to its magnetism. This was not a women's group hidden away in places where women were permitted to gather. At Greenham Common, they were visible, disruptive, and loud. Women went to Greenham to protest against nuclear weapons and left liberated. Greenham Common is a story of one protest, and it's a story of many, a movement of individuals, each grappling with their own inner battles. It's the story of a protest that created a generation of women ready and willing to commit their lives to challenging social injustice, whether through non-violent direct action for disarmament of nuclear weapons, the campaigning for the rights of disabled children, or providing practical support to refugees. 30 years on, its legacy is still felt keenly by those involved. And that's an important element of any protest, that the people who have the courage to stand up and take action transform their own lives, as well as striving to transform society. Remembering their stories is then a vital issue, remembering people like Jean Kay and those other women of Greenham Common. Jean Kay had retired and moved to Oxford by the time the cruise missiles left the base. The impact of Greenham on her life was enormous. After a long career as a primary school teacher, she became a full-time campaigner for social justice up until her death in 2013. When a youth prison was converted into an immigration detention centre in 1993 at Campsfield on the edge of Oxford, Jean, then 67, was outside protesting against the Home Office. It was one of the first centres to open in the UK. Jean joined a visitors group and came to know some of the asylum seekers and migrants being detained. She asked me if I would like to become a visitor, says Jill Baden, an old friend of Jean's, who at the time I interviewed her volunteered full-time for bail for immigration detainees in Oxford. Jill told me, I went in with her to get the hang of it, and at that time, detainees were very suspicious of us, and they would say things like, don't speak to these women, they're from the Home Office. Jill smiles at the memory. Jean was very convincingly not from the Home Office. Now, I want to end by briefly outlining the final strand to my storytelling, which is teaching, sharing, and learning from what others bring to the craft. This is part of what we don't always have time for, particularly as freelance journalists juggling projects and stories. This is time I'm grateful to have been given by Sussex and the Stuart Hall Foundation last year and more recently. And when sitting down to plan my fellowship, a key aspect for me was the opportunity to continue my existing efforts to widen participation in journalism by creating meaningful opportunities for working class, Black, Asian, and other communities poorly represented in the trade. So how might this work in a university setting? Well, working alongside academics and PhD students from the School of Media, Arts and Humanities, I hosted a series of workshops for teenagers in Brighton, Crawley, and London on writing and social justice. I began by asking them, what makes you angry? And we spent several sessions developing their answers, drawing on my professional experience, the skills and experience of the Sussex academics in the room with us, the writing of political theorists and academics past and present, and the people around us in our communities, at home, our parents and grandparents, their choices and rebellions. And in the case of one student, his grandfather, born in 1940s Nigeria, about whom the only thing he knew was that he is said to have dragged dead bodies up a hill. Understanding what this actually meant and the question of who he was as a white passing young person with Black heritage in 2020 Britain drove his inquiries. And through the process and through the workshops, he learned that his grandfather was in fact forced to drag dead bodies up a hill after a massacre in his village during the Biafran War. They're taking their stories, the stories they told themselves, and the new discoveries made through our collaborative writing process. We help them to focus their anger, shape and craft it into thoughts, and then words. Topics range from the public indifference to homelessness, sexual harassment, school expulsions, gender identity, and more. Some of the writing produced and the thinking being done was beautiful. Old familiar stories told with fresh voices and new insight. And so I'm going to stop here, but what I'd like us to do collectively this evening, perhaps, is to consider ways of continuing such collaborations, how we can continue to tell stories and consume stories that document injustice, but not only documenting injustice, but posing radical possibilities for a better future. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much for that talk, Rebecca. I mean, just from that brief introduction to your work, you can see the sort of the rigor with which you undertake your journalism, as well as the kind of the humanity that you use in doing that work. I'd like to invite the attendees to put any questions in the Q&A. And while people are doing that, I'd just like to ask you about the process of becoming a journalist who does this kind of work. I mean, we know that journalism as a profession, there is underrepresentation of marginalized voices. I wondered if you could just tell us a bit about your journey into journalism and how you got from the sort of traditional journalism to this more sort of storytelling based journalism.
Yeah. So I think just boringly, after university, I sort of worked for a bit and got a lot of work experience on local papers, in magazines, and then I got a fellowship, or kind of a scholarship from The Guardian, to study for a formal qualification in journalism at Sheffield University. So I did that maybe 2006, 2007. And it was quite useful, it was quite handy. It's very expensive. I imagine it's probably triple the price now. I'm not sure I'd recommend it for young people starting out, just because of the cost, and unless you can get some sort of scholarship to help pay for it. I think work experience is just as valuable. So after I did my course, then I went and worked for a finance magazine. So I worked in trade media for a long time, and a lot of working class and Black journalists do end up getting a lot of their experience in the trade press before then going on to the nationals or wherever, or forging a career. So I spent a few years in finance journalism and picked up a loads of skills, because I see journalism as a trade. I think there are certain skills that you need to learn to be able to do it effectively. And then I very stupidly, just after the crash, quit my job and thought, right, I'm going to write about human rights and social justice and change the world with my journalism, and ran out of money really quickly. So I had to do various things to support my freelance work. So I worked in call centres, I worked in a bookshop for ages. I was a stringer for the Washington Post London bureau for a while. So I was doing a bit of this and that in order to build up a portfolio of experience reporting on what I thought was really important. If that answers the question fully.
Yeah, I mean, I think what strikes me really is how journalism has kind of changed with the role of social media. And in fact, it's kind of almost pushing us to be more pithy in how we write, and sound bites, and what can you put in 250 characters on a tweet. So whereas your work has actually become more sort of expansive in that time. I think.
It's it's always been a bit of a tension for me, because I remember at journalism school, the writing that was kind of held up as something you should aspire to was the writing of the tabloids. So I remember, like, our journalism, one lesson where our teacher was, we were given like an intro paragraph from a Guardian article as an example of kind of bad writing, because it was just considered long-winded, whereas tabloid writing was something we were supposed to aspire to. So I think it's always been like that in journalism. That is how journalism is done. But journalism, the kind of gatekeepers to journalism are from one particular class, usually from two universities. They have a certain viewpoint, that tend to be men, and they think in a certain way. And I think as a result of that, there's can be a lack of creativity in output, and often I think the best journalists are usually outsiders, and that's why you have such strong, brilliant journalism from people, from working class people, from Black people over the years. It's not a new thing. It's always been the case, even when we've been marginalized in the profession. And one of my journalistic heroes is Ida B. Wells, who was a Black American investigative journalist who was documenting lynchings in the 19th century America, when a time when Black Americans had literally just gotten out of slavery, and that here was this sort of pioneering journalist writing these stories and investigating what had happened, and sort of making a noise and rabble rousing. So I take my inspiration from journalists like her, who kind of ignored what the kind of traditional idea of a journalist was supposed to be, and kind of forged her own path, telling the stories in the way that she thought they should be told.
So we have a question in the chat. So Rebecca, can you see that? So Tidings Ndivu, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that. So the question is, in Manchester, we have a radical tradition similar to what Stuart Hall stood for. How do you think a movement can be established for fundamental social change?
Okay, that's quite a massive question. Can I get some more clarification on the question? So when you say a movement for fundamental change,
I don't think the attendees can speak. So Tidings, if you could maybe add a bit more detail. But in the meantime, I have another question. Do you have advice on how to avoid woke washing and the appropriation of social justice campaigns and stories content by business or even right-wing stroke racist movements?
Yeah, that's
these aren't small questions.
A lot. I don't think you can avoid it. I think it's here, it's what's happening. I think what we have to do as people who are interested in the real truth is just to keep documenting those stories and working with our communities who are going through that injustice to tell those stories in the way that we know how. So I think it's still possible to do that and not buy into the so-called woke washing, or people kind of paying lip service to Black Lives Matter and other movements.
Yeah, so I might come back to sort of expand on that in a second, but we have a question from Chiamaka Igboyaka. Do you think independent journalism is underrated, and how do you think these stories can be projected beyond their already existing spaces?
Yeah, I definitely do think they are. I think one way they can be projected is the ripple effect that always happens when you do this reporting. I guess if you are going into this area of journalism, you're not going into it to become a superstar journalist. Like, it's not about you, it's about the stories. So a lot of my work is often picked up by journalists with perhaps a bigger platform or on the mainstream press, and that's a good thing, because it means then more people will understand what's going on and will be able to hear about it. I guess the difficulty is making sure that the way I work and the way I tell the stories is also translated when those sort of kind of more mainstream journalists pick up the story. And it can be tricky. Like, throughout my career, I've always had journalists from the BBC or from Channel 4, Panorama, programs like that, coming to me and saying, can I have your case studies? And in a way, I should say yes, because that means, you know, however many millions of people will watch it on the BBC or read it in one of the big papers. But at the same time, I've built up a relationship with these people and understanding that we're going to tell the story in a certain way. And I know that those journalists are rushed. There's a reason why they're coming to me. They don't have the time to give the story the space it needs to be told in such a way that it can provide an archive, it can live beyond this moment, so it can be a kind of base for future generations who want to understand how we fought against injustice today. Yeah. So it doesn't really answer your question, but I think it's just because I don't have a straightforward answer. It's something I'm always thinking about.
Yeah, but it suggests there is almost this kind of trade-off. You know, if your work is about bearing witness and ensuring that you have sort of some control over how that is projected when you've done all that kind of in-depth work behind the scenes, versus a platform where some of those nuances might be lost, or might even end up being misrepresented. So yeah, I think that's definitely something that your work represents. So got a few more questions.
I could go back to Tidings, who has provided some clarification. So coalition of different groups like Black Lives Matter. Yeah, so Actually, some of the work I have done in the past has been, because like I said in my talk, a key part of the work is not just me doing the work, but it's also sharing skills, learning from other groups. So I have done workshops, like storytelling workshops with activist groups, with people who are experiencing an injustice and want a way to not just tell their story for consumption, but kind of take ownership of the storytelling process. So I did a bit of work with our Albanian unaccompanied minors in East London, and went through storytelling with them, because often these children and these people are put forward to media organizations to tell their story. So I think one way that we can kind of build a movement and take control of some of these stories is by working away from the public eye to think about how we tell these stories and workshop ideas and workshop things like writing and thinking about social injustice and change.
So actually, there's some other questions in the chat which I think you can see, but I wanted to ask you, like, how do you get your leads? I mean, you know, the range of stories that you spoke about, from, you know, remembering Greenham to Black mental health to austerity. So how do you choose your stories? And the related question in the chat about, you know, there's very difficult stories. How do you do that work, dealing with those injustices and struggles and not despair?
Yeah. So I think finding leads is, again, that's just a journalistic tool. There's a lot of investigation. It's a lot of door knocking. Just, I guess I always start with a question. Like when I started reporting on refugees and migrants, for example, I was not seeing certain stories in the mainstream press, and I kind of wanted to know more about the people who were kind of risking their lives to get to this country. I also had my own personal history of my parents' migrations journeys and family still in parts of Nigeria and other countries who want to come here, and different ways people think about coming here. So I had all these questions, and I saw those stories being told in the media, and it's usually not by someone who looks like me. It's usually by, you know, it's usually a white guy, because they're the kind of authoritative voice who are meant to tell these stories. So I was interested in what would happen if I went along and took control and told some of those stories. With a lot of the stories, because I kind of went through the traditional route and went to journalism school and worked on kind of in the financial press, I spent a lot of time having to do cold calling in those jobs. When I worked for the Washington Post, I think it was when Prince William got married, and one of the worst jobs I had to do was go outside Buckingham Palace and just ask people what they thought of it, find people who were actually interested and who cared about it. It was awful, but it's good training in kind of forcing you to like speak to strangers and just I don't know, ask questions and be a bit nosy, because that's kind of essential for being a journalist. And the question about resilience, I think, we've talked a lot about this. I struggle with it all the time. It's really hard, and I think I've definitely had periods of burnout and not feeling fantastic, because you're doing this awful work, and you're telling stories and meeting people when they've experienced something awful. And personally, some of the stories I feel quite close to. And then you've, as an independent journalist, you've not got this kind of support of an organisation or colleagues that you can go to. And then as a Black woman, you you kind of gaslit by society saying, well, this actually is not a problem, this is not happening. So it's really tough. I think one of the positives I found in doing this work is that you naturally find your people. There are lots of people who are also working in little silos, not just other journalists, but photographers, academics, lawyers, people working in charities, all people who are kind of trying to do this work, but not getting support from the wider establishment. And you eventually find those people, and you have these little communities, and that kind of is what keeps you going over time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we have another question from Dipesh Pandya in the Q&A about forms of archive, accessibility for future generations, and the omnipresent threat of erasure. I think that's a really good question. We think about the sort of battle for history that's ongoing at the moment. Like, what will happen to these stories 50 years hence, you know? What do you think?
For me, that is like one of the things that keeps me going. I don't care if no one reads any of my stories today. I know that there is a record of this thing happening in Britain today, and that's invaluable. I think online, being able to kind of work with online platforms like Open Democracy, where, you know, the project that I work on called Shine a Light, which is kind of investigative journalism storytelling, there's a massive archive that goes back more than a decade, just documenting various injustices that have happened, and they're really useful. I think one of the reasons they're useful is our approach to the work. So they're not simply just a hot take or a reaction to what's happening today. These are deeply researched, they're rigorous. So if you suddenly feel angry about, I don't know, Dido Harding, or what's happening with certain aspects of managing the pandemic being outsourced to the private sector, you can go to her archive and see the history of this being done by the last few governments, and how we have a system now where it's very easy, if you've got a mate in the government, to get a contract to do X, Y, and Z. So I think archiving is so important. Documenting and telling these stories is important, but telling these stories in a way that is not just here's my response to what's going on is key. Like, we need to create quality archives, and we need to keep telling these stories.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a couple more questions in the chat. The one related to covering Prince William's marriage and the question of royal reporting. I mean, that obviously is something, you know, that very live in this country, and particularly at the moment. Yeah. What are your thoughts on sort of royal reporting and its status in the UK?
Do I have to have an opinion? I really don't know. I just think they're all bunkers. It's weird. Yeah. I don't understand it. Yeah. Okay. I'm a Republican. I just, it's bizarre. But I think the way it's playing out is really useful. I think we can all use it to understand a little bit about how the media works, because it's not just royal reporters that kind of have this herd mentality. It's also journalists who report in Westminster. It's journalists who cover the financial markets. You have these little kind of communities of journalists, and they don't just work, they work across publications, across broadcasters, and often they'll agree a line, and that's what will get reported. Mm-hmm. And if they all, again, come from the same sort of backgrounds, come from two universities, they're going to kind of have a certain way of thinking. And that means the stories we're being told aren't always truthful, or there are certain kind of viewpoints that we're missing, basically, from the conversation.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, in terms of, obviously, newsmakers produce news which they think people want to hear, right? So how do we tackle that side of the equation in terms of they're just responding to consumer demand?
I just think that's really patronizing. I have a lot more hope in people. Like, the people I write about and I talk to are kind of the people who I'm writing for anyway. And when I talk to them about this writing, that they're engaged, they're interested, they want to hear these stories about what is happening to them. And also, it's ridiculous, no one wants to hear bad news. So if we just kind of followed the demand, there wouldn't be a demand to hear about, you know, a child dying because his parents are trying to get to the UK and things like that. I think, you can't be led by those metrics when you're doing this sort of work.
Okay, so we have another question in the Q&A from Wasi. So again, this is picking up on the burnout that you might experience doing such tough stories. And you already mentioned some of it, but like, where and how do you find support for yourself?
So Again, I guess it's just finding other people who are doing similar work to you, talking through some of the work that you're doing. The reason why I'm hesitating with my answer is that I'm not very good at this. And I'm really bad at managing kind of burnout and stress and managing just the horror that I'm constantly consuming. I realized this working with when I was covering the death of Rashan Charles, who's a young Black guy who was restrained by police in Hackney. And while working on that story, I worked alongside a young Muslim woman, and I was sort of mentoring her and kind of encouraging her to kind of get involved in journalism and reporting. And one of the things that I was sure to do is that, for example, after each day, I would take her for coffee and we'd have a chat about something that wasn't, someone being killed by the police. And I'd make sure she takes breaks, try and get her to, I don't know, do other things in the evening, not overwork. This all sounds really basic, but I think most academics probably and freelancers will know that, you don't do a 9 to 5. It's always just whenever the thing is done, which can be weeks and months and so on. So I would try and force like a proper schedule for her so that she was just looking after herself while doing this work. But also not working on more than one difficult story at once is the recommendation that I haven't stuck to, but I think is really important to do.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the idea of boundaries, and yeah, as an academic, I think that's something that we certainly relate to, about maintaining boundaries. But I was also struck by when you were doing your talk about the sort of the hope that comes through, and you talked a lot about resistance and solidarity. I mean, I was going to ask him, there are a few other questions in the chat, but I'm just going to ask you, like, this year, or the last year and a bit, with the pandemic, with the kind of post George Floyd kind of interest and also, backlash to, Black Lives Matter, how do you feel about where we are at the moment in terms of, is there hope? Is there solidarity that we can look forward to? Or
yeah, I'm absolutely inspired by all the young people kind of just going out on the streets and just showing their anger. I think that sort of lack of indifference is really inspiring, and you can't not feel hopeful when you see that. How it's playing out is a different matter, and the backlash is a different matter, but I think the hope is the fact that people are angry and they're showing it. And that's a beginning to action, and that's beginning to change. So I'm definitely hopeful. I'm nervous and actually quite stressed about the kind of shallow and superficial embracing of anti-racism, because I think that could have negative effects. I think people or institutions paying lip service to anti-racism and not actually following through with structural change, or making just following through, I guess, I think is really dangerous. And that's what we've had over the last decade, this idea that we are kind of an anti-racist country. Meanwhile, statistics and people's experiences show that that's not actually the case.
Yeah. I mean, when you said working with young people and their anger, and it's good to see that, and you talked earlier about your writing workshops and channeling that anger. I mean, this relates to a question in the chat about, how do we get those young people into doing that kind of authentic critical journalism, which you do, and how would you advise them to kind of, try and progress?
So it's quite tricky, and it's something I'm really passionate about. I haven't got the answer yet, because journalism is such a closed profession. The last year has been good because a lot of newspapers have started to recognize that they do have an issue with race, and so they're creating all these sort of mentoring projects and schemes to try and address that. But I don't think it's enough. I would advise against young people kind of being pigeonholed very early in their career and kind of mined for their trauma and forced to in order to get on in journalism, to tell their own experience of racism or being working class or whatever it is, and to maybe spend a bit of time trying to get experience in building their their skills, so research skills, speaking to people, trying to get like work experience with a publication, regardless of whether or not it can't always be the Guardian or the BBC. Sometimes it might have to be your local newspaper, but get that experience because it's so important, and build your skills, and then find an area that you are interested in and that you want to investigate, rather than starting off having to kind of put yourself out there and tell your whole personal story, because I feel like that's kind of exploitative. I mean, it works for some people do want to be columnists and they want to do that, but I have through my own sort of activism and organising behind the scenes, I've met a lot of particularly young Black journalists who are kind of forced into this sort of confessional type writing, when really they want to be investigating things that injustices that they've grown up with, things that they know about, and they've got a bit of expertise, but they just don't have the support or skills to be able to kind of tell those stories. Someone asked a question about finance, and I want to answer that because I do think it's really important. Yeah, it is difficult to kind of make a living this way, but I haven't just done it over a year. Like it's when I first kind of went freelance to focus on this, I did have to have other jobs in order to kind of pay my bills. And it's only over time that I built a reputation and got some industry recognition that I was able to then kind of raise money for work that I wanted to do. But it isn't easy. And I think it's almost becoming like maybe 20 years ago, if you're an actor, you couldn't just survive on acting, you'd have to do other jobs. It's not ideal and it's an awful way to look at it, but I don't know what the solution is at the moment, really, to that. That's quite a negative way to end, isn't it?
It's realistic, but I guess it's like, you know, what are the rewards in terms of, you know, ethically and morally, you know, for pursuing that course. So I think we're coming up to the end of our slot. So I'd like to say thank you so much, Rebecca, for that amazing talk, and also with the Q&A session. You've been really, really inspiring, and your reflection has been really insightful, and I hope you know, useful to the attendees. So thank you very much.